everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day here on today's show, we'll be continuing with our positional rankings. The running back position, a position that has been separating itself from the rest of the league. And I was reading an article earlier talking about the importance of the running back position and how people view it compared to ever more important positions such as quarterback, offensive linemen, and things of that nature. And how this revolution of middle-aged running backs is starting to have people think differently about the position. But from a fantasy perspective, I'm starting to see a different narrative. I'm starting to see a lot of top-tier talent separate itself. The Saquons, the Derrick Henrys of the world. The players we talk about we know can be explosive week in, week out. But then this middle tier that's really weird to dissect and analyze just because of the fact you never know who's going to have a good game or remain consistent week in, week out at the running back position. And all four of these guys, for some reason or other, remain in this middle tier and really haven't found consistency. But in certain matchups, I feel they can be winners for you from a fantasy perspective. And so without further ado, as the season goes on, as I explain my running back positional rankings to you, you might see some players you are largely unaccustomed with seeing on a week-by-week basis perform well in fantasy, just because of the diversity of this position. So, without further ado, let us jump right into our second positional rankings of the week with my running back, starting off with a guy who defines this mid-tier and defines inconsistency this season. Without his starting quarterback to start the season, looked pretty inept and struggled mightily without him. But now that he's back, he's reborn yet again. And so that's why I have to pick De'Von Achane against the Packers in a big Thanksgiving matchup. Now, the reason why I think De'Von Achane, who had 20.6 fantasy points versus New England, is going to continue to shine, even in tough matchups as this one against the Packers, is because of the fact that he has become a multifaceted weapon for the Dolphins, and someone who isn't just seen as a one-dimensional player anymore, where his runs last year generated a lot of explosiveness for this Dolphins offense and supplemented the explosiveness and verticality of this receiving core very well. He truly is starting to become one of the go-to options right now for this Dolphins offense. And so that's why I feel like even in tough matchups where you expect guys like Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle to step up, these unsung guys who haven't really performed on this season, the Achanes, the Jonnu Smiths now of the world, can really make their presence felt in this matchup. It's a very physical Packers defense. However, I do feel like there's going to come a time and place where this Packers secondary and defensive front, most especially, is going to get exploited. Just because you can't necessarily predicate yourselves on takeaways too much if you're a Pacific defense. They performed very well to this point in this regard, but at some point along the way, chances are teams are going to find a way to get past the takeaway issue and exploit you, whether it be through the run game that opens up the pass game or just attacking downfield. The Dolphins can do it in multiplicity. So that's why I feel like De'Von Achane is going to have a big day Thanksgiving. Now for the second running back, rather than picking, this is a guy who's also had his ups and downs this season. At one point scored a touchdown in, I believe, 9 consecutive games, but now kind of hitting a rut in his season, but it's going to be a huge factor down the stretch for this playoff hopeful, and that is Kyren Williams going up against the Saints. This is a matchup that can potentially be a trap game for the Rams, but I feel like if they utilize Kyren Williams, they will have no problems. 11.2 fantasy points versus Philly in a game where I really would have liked to see him more in terms of how they could have attacked Philly differently and this physical defense differently. But going up against the Saints, who are on a little bit of an uptick but are still struggling defensively, look for Kyren Williams to yet again be the tone setter for this offense. I feel like, the reason why this Rams offense has struggled even with the return of Kupp and Nacua has been because they haven't necessarily been reliant as much on the run game these past couple of weeks. And it's kind of frustrating if you're a Rams fan just because of the fact that it opens up a lot more for you if Kyren Williams is playing well. And so in this game, I gotta have a game, I feel like, for both of these teams, because technically the Saints are still in the playoff picture. I feel like Kyren Williams is someone who is going to be the X factor, not just for this one, but down the stretch for the rest of the season for the Rams trying to get into the playoffs. And so I can't ignore a player who is primed and ready to go for a stretch run for this Rams team that's hoping that it can get in by winning the NFC West and make some noise potentially in the postseason. So look out for Kyren Williams to have a big day, and potentially a lot of big days for this Rams team down the stretch of the season. Then for the third pick, a guy who disappointed this past week, much to my happiness and delight, but going up against another very physical defensive team, much more physical than the Seattle team they faced, which was kind of a surprising thing to point out in the Seattle success, but I digress. James Conner. I feel like, if, the Cardinals can get back to that dominant run game, this game could be a potential upset here, because I think the Vikings are going to have to be favored, seeing as to how that Seattle front got after Kyler Murray and really slowed down his mobility and his dynamic abilities in this offense. But I feel like, the Vikings can get got if a team can get going for the run game. James Conner only had 9.9 fantasy points versus Seattle. And I don't know whether this was an under-reliance on him in this situation, but it's one of those moments where you have to question what this Cardinals offense was doing in that game. Maybe they don't want to show too much for their next matchup 2 weeks down the road, but in a very physical game ahead for them against the Vikings, look for the Cardinals to try and get back on track by getting back to what they know best. Those outside zone schemes between the tackles to get James Conner and Trey Benson in space, but specifically James Conner, because he is the guy who's the difference maker and the tone setter for this Cardinals offense. If he gets going, this one could be a track meet. They could force the Vikings' hands in this game. And this is no indictment of the Vikings' defense, but I don't really feel like it's seen as physical and dominant of a run game as the Cardinals can be. And I know that, it feels like that game against the Seattle Seahawks slowed the Cardinals' momentum a little bit, but this could be a surprising get-right game for them if they play their cards right and involve James Conner a lot more into their game plan in this one. So look for James Conner in a very tough matchup, perhaps the toughest matchup of all four of these guys this week, to really stand out. And I feel like, for the rest of the season, for as long as the Cardinals are in contention, James Conner is going to be an X factor in every single game they play, divisional or otherwise. So I can't ignore James Conner's impact, whether positive or negative in the stretch. We'll have to see in terms of fantasy implications. And then the last guy that I want to highlight in this one is a guy who I have really high hopes for in this game and really high hopes for in terms of determining how I view this team on the stretch, especially in these divisional contests, because these are the important ones for the Steelers team. If they don't win these games, then by all means they could be out of the playoff picture by the end of December even. But if they win them and they show their versatility in the offense through this guy who we know is capable of being a big producer for them, then the sky's the limit for the Steelers team. Because complimentary football is what they do, and Najee Harris defines complimentary football. He only had 7.4 fantasy points versus Cleveland, whether it was a product of the snow or just because they felt like their best way to attack this Browns defense was try to surprise them by going downfield early and often. He wasn't utilized as much as I would have liked him to in this very important divisional contest, and as a result, they got punked by a 3-8 Browns team. However, in this contest against the Bengals, in order to, keep them off the field and try and get more efficiency and effectiveness out of your offense, Najee Harris has to be an X factor. And I feel he will be. Because the Bengals' run defense, as we've said all season long, is the most atrocious in the league. And I feel like, as much as Mike Tomlin insists on trying to open up the downfield passing game with Russ and Pickens and what have you, Najee Harris is the player that I feel can be the difference in the postseason even. So you have to get him revved up and ready to go should the Steelers make the playoffs and get a favorable matchup, because this is an offense that predicates itself too much on forcing things. It just needs to relax and be one of those offenses that isn't necessarily explosive, but knows it can keep possession. The pass game is married well to the run game, and everything clicks. Because if it doesn't, that's where the Steelers struggle. And yes, you can rely on this defense because it's been one of the best in the league, and we know it has good performances in it week in, week out. But until I see consistency, not just from the pass game but the run game as well, then I can't go all in on the Steelers team anymore. And that's just the way it is. And so Najee Harris has to be an X factor. And I feel like he has the talent and potential to step up and assume a role as an X factor for this team in the stretch, because I don't feel like Steelers fans are going to be happy with a first round playoff exit. They want a deep run. So look for Najee Harris to be more incorporated into this offense's plans down the stretch, especially in these divisional games, because the AFC North is now a division of these top two teams in the Ravens and Steelers trying not to have their seasons completely ruined, trying not to go off the rails. And the Bengals and Browns are two very intriguing spoils. And the Steelers play both of them in the next 2 weeks. So it's going to be highly integral to have a certain game plan in which you're not forcing things if you're the Steelers. And thus, that's why Najee Harris is someone who I'm looking to step up in a huge way for this Steelers offense. But let me know what you think in the comments. All four of these running backs, highly capable of putting up big performances. It's just about consistency and matchups. But let me know what you think about them in the comments. But coming up next, our third positional rankings of the week with our wide receivers. Another very volatile position week in, week out. You definitely don't want to miss who I see rising above in this next segment right after this short break.